My name is Damien, and I come from a small rural town on the outskirts of Jackson, Mississippi. If there's one thing I've learned since I was a kid, it's that some things can't be explained, and others are better left unquestioned. I thought I'd seen it all. Burials in backyards, whispers in the dead of night, people whose faces seemed to shift when they thought no one was watching. But what happened to my cousin Ethan still gives me chills to this day. Like most stories, it started small. At the age of 6, Ethan would talk to someone he called the man in the corner. He claimed the figure lived inside the bathroom mirror. My aunt and uncle thought it was just an imaginary friend, harmless childhood fantasy. But over time, the conversations became longer, darker, and far too real. By the time he turned 12, Ethan began having strange blackouts. Doctors diagnosed it as epilepsy, but all the tests came back normal. One night, he was found standing on the roof of the house in the middle of the night, with no ladder, no way up. His mum found him staring at the stars, muttering only one thing: "He's coming. He wants to stay with me." The strangest part was that Ethan had no memory of these events. Over the years, there were videos, witnesses, even audio recordings of him speaking in a dialect no one could identify. One of those clips eventually made its way into an occult forum online, and that's when everything truly spiraled. He became distant. His once honey-colored eyes began turning black like coal on some nights. He stopped sleeping. He'd stare into the same corner of his bedroom for hours. The pets in the house grew sick and died mysteriously one by one. Desperate, his mother, Susan, turned to local churches, healers, doctors, but no one could make sense of what was happening. Just when it seemed there was nothing left to try, a final glimmer of hope appeared at her doorstep. But that I'll get to in a moment. Before I go on, I have to warn you, this story isn't for everyone. And if you love tales that make your skin crawl and make you double-check under the bed, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. What you're about to hear won't be easy to forget. Now take a deep breath, because what followed would shatter a family's world and unearth a horror that had been waiting for generations. No one in our family wanted to admit it, but the signs had always been there. Ethan wasn't like other kids. Even as a toddler, he had a strange sensitivity. He could sense temperature changes in sealed rooms, hear things no one else could, and recall conversations that had never happened. Susan remembered one time when Ethan, barely 3 years old, looked up at her and said, "Grandma says she's not lonely anymore." The problem was, Grandma had passed away just a week before, and no one had mentioned it to him. That was just one of many eerie moments they chose to ignore. As he grew older, the house itself felt heavier. Mirrors would shatter overnight without explanation. Lights would flicker randomly. And whenever Ethan got sick or anxious, things would happen. Doors slamming on their own, chairs moving across the room, voices echoing from the plumbing. During a family dinner one afternoon, Ethan suddenly went into a trance. He froze, eyes locked on the ceiling fan. Then, in a monotone voice, he said, "You shouldn't have buried it there." No one understood what he meant until days later, when his father dug a hole in the yard to plant a tree and uncovered human remains. The police called it an old discovery, possibly from colonial times. But from that day forward, the energy in the home changed completely. Neighborhood dogs barked non-stop toward their house. Father Julian, the local priest, was called in to bless the place. The moment he finished praying, he collapsed. He never returned. That's when Ethan began showing marks on his body. They weren't bruises or scratches. These were symbols. Circles, runes, intersecting lines that would appear at dawn and vanish by sunset. No doctor could explain them or determine how they formed. The dreams grew more intense. Ethan would scream in the middle of the night, speaking languages no one in the family understood. One early morning, Susan found him sobbing in the kitchen, eyes rolled back, hands covered in soil. When she tried to touch him, he shoved her away with a force that wasn't his. It was at that point that fear truly took hold. Not just for Ethan, but for everyone in the house. Their home, once filled with laughter and music, became a cold, silent place. Visitors stopped coming, school friends avoided him, and with every passing day, it felt like something else was taking over. But the most horrifying part was yet to come, and it was headed their way from very far off. Things completely unraveled when Ethan tore apart his bedroom in a frenzied fit one night. Neighbors heard the screaming, but no one dared knock. When his parents finally entered, they found him spinning his head in unnatural motions, murmuring the name Iktan over and over. Symbols drawn in blood covered the walls, each crafted with surgical precision. Susan and her husband Mark rushed him to the General Hospital in Baton Rouge. He underwent MRIs, neurological tests, psychiatric evaluations. Everything came back clear. There's no brain damage, no signs of psychosis. Your son is healthy, they were told. But how could they explain that Ethan hadn't slept in 4 days, that his body temperature dropped to near fatal levels with no cause? One hospital night, a nurse walked into his room and found him standing at the window, staring at the parking lot. When she asked what he was doing, he answered in a deep, unfamiliar voice, "I'm waiting for the earth to open." The nurse quit that same week. Science had run out of answers, and Ethan kept getting worse. His eyes blackened more frequently. His skin took on an ashen tone. At home, objects kept flying across rooms. A chair slammed into the wall while the room was empty. In a final act of desperation, Susan wrote a letter. She didn't know who else to turn to. She compiled her son's story, videos, photos, dates, everything. She mailed it to the Vatican in Rome, like tossing a message into the ocean, hoping someone might read it. She expected nothing, but the content was so disturbing, it couldn't go unnoticed. 2 weeks later, she received a call from an international number. A calm voice with a foreign accent said, "We've reviewed your case. A representative will be sent to assess the situation. Your faith will be tested, Mrs. Susan." She hung up, unsure if it was real or a cruel joke. But that same evening, she checked her email and found a message. It was a travel confirmation. A visitor would arrive in Jackson in under 10 days with full confidentiality. The sender? Brotherhood of the Order of Sacred Rites. From that moment on, the energy in the house shifted. For the first time in weeks, Ethan slept, but his breathing sounded like it came from someone else's body. Mark began having nightmares filled with fire, tunnels, and a voice repeating, "He's waiting for you." Susan knew then it wasn't just her son at risk. Whatever this was, it was pulling their entire family into something ancient. And just when they thought things couldn't get stranger, true hell knocked on their door. No one noticed his arrival. No reporters, no security, no onlookers. He stepped off the plane at Jackson Medgar Wiley Evers International Airport with a dark leather briefcase and 2 silent companions. He wasn't dressed like a senior cleric. He wore no visible symbols. He looked like any man, but the air around him felt different. They called him Pope Francis, though those who truly knew him understood that wasn't his real name. Susan recognized him instantly. She'd seen his face in documentaries, on news broadcasts, during televised mass. What was someone like him doing at her modest home near the outskirts of the Hidalgo neighborhood? She didn't understand, but deep down, something told her that after all the terror, someone was finally coming with answers. Pope Francis entered their home with a calm expression, as if he already knew what awaited. The moment he crossed the threshold, the wall clock stopped. Lights flickered. A crucifix fell from the wall. Ethan, who had been asleep since the previous morning, rose from his bed with his eyes still closed. He shuffled barefoot down the hallway and stopped in front of the priest. Then he spoke. "You're too late. I'm already his." The voice wasn't Ethan's. It echoed with a hollow, cavernous tone, as if it came from the depths of the earth. The priest's companions exchanged quick glances, but the man of faith didn't flinch. He stepped forward, raised his right hand, and placed an object against the boy's chest. It was an ancient relic, a small metallic cross, engraved with markings no one could decipher. Instantly, Ethan collapsed like a lifeless puppet. He was unconscious, but still breathing. The priest asked to be left alone with the boy. For 2 straight hours, he remained locked inside the room with him. No screaming, no crashing sounds, only whispered prayers, and something like a distant wailing that no one could quite explain. When he finally came out, his shirt was soaked in sweat and his hands were trembling. He only said a few words. "This isn't a typical possession. The evil here doesn't live only in the boy. It's in the roots, the blood, the land." That night, nobody slept. The windows fogged up without cause. The television flicked on by itself, and for the first time, Susan saw the silhouette of a long-faced man walking through the yard, then vanishing without a trace. The feeling was unmistakable. A spiritual war was beginning, and their home was the battlefield. And right now, before we enter the most intense part of this story, I invite you, tap the icon of the yellow lamp and stay with us, so together we can confront disturbing and chilling mysteries, because what Pope Francis faced next was not from this world. Before dawn broke, Pope Francis requested that Ethan's room be prepared. He shut all the windows, draped the mirrors with black cloths, and placed blessed candles in every corner. In the center, he drew a circle using salt, consecrated oil, and fragments of obsidian, something out of the ordinary, something ancient. Susan watched silently, her heart in her throat. The priest pulled a worn book from his leather case, covered in symbols that looked otherworldly. It was an ancient manual of forbidden sacred rites, written in a mix of Latin and Nahuatl. He opened it carefully and began muttering softly, as if calling out to someone from a distant place. Ethan remained unconscious on the bed. But the moment the first prayer was uttered, his eyes snapped open. They weren't his. They were pitch black, no iris, no pupil. The room's temperature plummeted so fast, everyone's breath turned visible. "You thought you could cast me out with prayers?" The voice inside Ethan's body snarled. Pope Francis didn't answer. He held his crucifix firmly, pressed it against the boy's chest, and continued praying. Ethan began to convulse. His body arched violently, slamming against the mattress with inhuman force. The candles all went out at once, but the salt circle remained untouched. Then, the entire bed lifted a few inches off the floor. The priest's companions instinctively stepped back in fear. The entity inside began speaking in multiple tongues simultaneously, reciting names of people Pope Francis had never shared with anyone. One name in particular turned his blood to ice: Elias. That name belonged to his younger brother, who had mysteriously vanished when they were children. His body was never found, but the entity spoke it with a cruel grin, knowing precisely where to strike. Pope Francis lost focus. His hands trembled. Ethan jerked upright with stiff robotic movements and screamed with such force that the windows rattled. "He's not dead! He's just with me!" At that exact moment, the rosary the priest had carried since his seminary days snapped in half. The beads rolled across the floor, spilling outside the circle. One of the candles relit itself with a flickering blue flame. Ethan laughed, not with his voice, but with a discordant blend of giggles. Children, men, women, animals, all layered together. Pope Francis steadied himself and shouted a phrase in Latin with all the strength left in his soul. Everything stopped. Ethan collapsed to the ground, lifeless in appearance. But when checked, he was still breathing, barely, slowly. Whatever had taken over him had retreated, but not left. Now the shadow was hiding, and that made it even more dangerous, because what they were fighting was no ordinary possession. It was something ancient, something that had endured through the centuries, and it wasn't going to surrender easily. That same night, while the tension still clung to the air, and Ethan slept as if nothing had happened, Pope Francis sat in the living room holding a folder. He had spent years investigating cases like this around the globe, but this one was different. Too many irregularities. Ethan's reaction to the obsidian symbol, the ancient tongue he whispered, the moving markings on his skin. Then Susan, her hands trembling, handed him a dusty wooden box that had belonged to her great-grandfather. No one had opened it in decades. Inside were old letters, hand-drawn maps, and a small humanoid figure carved from black stone. One note bore a chilling inscription: "The bloodline of the Tsekub cannot be broken. The Guardian must be reborn." Pope Francis examined every document, connecting the dots. Ethan's great-grandfather, named Itzcoatl Tsekub, had once been a member of a secret sect during the Porphyrian era. They practiced forbidden pre-Hispanic rituals, including human sacrifices to summon ancient spirits in exchange for protection and power. One of those rituals, it seemed, had never been properly sealed. The spirit wasn't released, it had been trapped, and the vessel chosen to imprison it was the bloodline of the one who performed the rite. From then on, every generation was born marked until one child was weak enough to break the seal. That child was Ethan. The land where the house now stood had once been a ceremonial Mexica site. No one knew because the evidence had been buried with the victims of that cult. But some elderly neighbors still remembered. Mrs. Ophelia, an old woman who lived down the street, confirmed through tears. That place, where the boy lives, they used to do things there. You could hear drums at night, and in the morning the soil would be soaked in blood. The atmosphere grew heavier after that revelation. Cracks appeared in the walls where none had been before. Plants withered despite regular watering. Most disturbing of all, the markings on Ethan's body began to move. Literally, they shifted at night, rearranging themselves to form a larger symbol. Pope Francis no longer had doubts. What they were dealing with was an ancestral entity, an ancient force known as Ixcan, the devourer of roots, once summoned to punish entire villages for spiritual betrayals. Now he understood why nothing had worked. Because this wasn't a demon, it was a living curse, one waiting to be fully unleashed. And if that happened, it wouldn't just be Ethan who was lost. The entire city could be dragged into the abyss. At midnight, Ethan awoke screaming with such raw power that the windows shook. His voice wasn't human, it was a guttural, primal roar, layered with 1,000 distorted echoes. Susan ran to the room, but Pope Francis stopped her. "If you go in now, you won't come out." The priest had prepared a second spiritual confrontation, but this time he wasn't using conventional methods. He placed obsidian geometric figures shaped like the Mexica cross around the bed. Each was marked with consecrated blood. As he chanted, the lights flickered, the room filled with a rancid stench like rotting flesh under the sun. Ethan rose, but his body moved like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. His arms dangled, his neck twisted beyond anatomical limits. His face distorted, skin stretching, eyes sinking, jaw dislocating, until a maniacal grin stretched from ear to ear. "You have no power here, Lorenzo," said the voice, now sounding like a chorus of weeping children. And then they saw it. For the first time, the entity manifested, not in dreams or whispers, but in visible form. A spectral figure emerged from the wall, elongated limbs dragging behind, fingers like knives, a stretched skull with hollow eye sockets. Its skin was dark, cracked like dried mud. It moved slowly behind Ethan, guiding him. Pope Francis raised his crucifix to move forward, but his body was pinned by an invisible force. He couldn't breathe. Something was crushing him to the floor. "This is not your battle, old man. He is mine," the creature spat without moving its lips. The priest's companions, watching from the doorway, tried to intervene. One began bleeding from his ears. The other collapsed, eyes blank, whispering incoherently. From the living room, Susan prayed harder than ever in her life. Then the entity spoke again. "Elias," Pope Francis screamed. He felt his chest crack from within. A buried memory rose. His little brother, vanishing into the jungle of Tabasco over 50 years ago. His body never found. Could it be? No, it wasn't possible. But the entity knew everything. It fed on his pain. It used his guilt. Candles burst, windows shattered. Ethan began to levitate, spinning slowly like a puppet suspended in air. And just when the priest thought all was lost, an idea surfaced. One final option, a ritual so old and dangerous it had been forbidden by the church itself. If he wanted to defeat Ixcan, he would have to risk everything. After that night, Pope Francis locked himself in the guest room for hours. He didn't eat. He didn't speak. He just scrawled symbols onto old pages, combining forgotten prayers with dead languages. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. He had made a decision. When he emerged, he walked up to Susan and said in a grave tone, "I'm going to try, but I cannot promise I'll come back." The ritual he was preparing wasn't found in any ordinary liturgical texts. It belonged to a lineage of ancient practices, known only by a handful of priests. It required sacred items, but also personal elements, a confession before dawn, a 72-hour total fast, and an intimate object from the possessed that represented innocence. Lorenzo used a wooden figure Ethan had carved as a child, a jaguar missing its tail. He placed it in the center of a circle made of salt, cemetery soil, and lamb's blood. The walls were draped in black cloth, and in each corner he lit incense made from copal. Ethan was placed in the center of the room, tied to a chair carved from sacred wood. He didn't resist. His eyes remained shut, yet he whispered under his breath, as if speaking to someone on the other side. Outside, the neighborhood dogs began howling. The sky clouded over despite no forecast of storms. Pope Francis began the rite. His words echoed through the room like sharp strikes. With every phrase, the air thickened. The candles burned more intensely. One of them turned black. Ethan convulsed violently. The ropes creaked. A high-pitched whistling filled the room. Then, a voice emerged from the boy's body. "You can't trap me again. You don't even know what you've unleashed." Lorenzo said nothing. He kept praying, now drenched in sweat. Cracks began to form beneath his feet. A dense shadow rose from Ethan's chest, a dark vapor shaped like a face. It was Ixcan, trying to break free, searching for another host, another weak spot. The priest knew this was the final test. If he stopped praying even for a moment, the entity would consume him. And for an instant, he hesitated. He remembered his brother. He remembered the night he vanished. He remembered the sound of the jungle swallowing everything whole. Then, with every ounce of strength, he shouted the last verse of the ritual. "By the fire of the eternal, by the blood of the righteous, let your name be sealed, Ixcan. May your hunger die in darkness." A deafening blast followed. The windows shattered, the walls shook. Ethan screamed as if his soul were being torn out. Lorenzo collapsed, unconscious. Then, silence. But the evil had not been defeated. It had simply changed form. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind outside had stilled. Ethan was slumped over, unconscious. Pope Francis lay on the ground, motionless. His hands burned from prolonged contact with the obsidian relic. Susan, trembling, crept forward. She touched her son. He was warm, but his pulse was faint. She tried speaking to him, but his lips didn't move. Then a wave of freezing air swept through the room, and with it, a figure appeared. It wasn't Ixcan. It was a child. A boy no older than 8, with dark hair and pale skin, dressed in an old-fashioned shirt, as if from another time. He didn't walk. He floated. His eyes were hollow, but his expression wasn't malevolent. He drifted toward Ethan, leaned close to his ear and whispered something. No one heard what he said, but even unconscious, Ethan began to cry. A tear slid down his cheek. His body, responding to that silent message, started to tremble. The markings on his skin glowed with a golden light, the dark lines forming a symbol, cracked like brittle glass. Ixcan's shadow, still hovering above his chest, recoiled violently. It screamed, it shrieked, but it couldn't stop what was happening. Light flooded the room. The walls gleamed. The cracks vanished. The candles extinguished simultaneously, and a deep, profound peace descended upon them all. For a moment, the fear vanished, as if it had never existed. And in that moment of light, Pope Francis opened his eyes, but what he saw wasn't the room. It was a space between worlds, where shadow and light wove together. Standing before him was the child, staring silently. "Thank you," the boy said. his voice seeming to echo from deep within Lorenzo's own heart. Lorenzo tried to respond, but couldn't. He only felt a pressure in his chest, and then darkness. When he awoke, he was lying on a hospital stretcher. A doctor looked at him in disbelief. "Do you know your heart stopped for nearly 3 minutes?" He didn't answer. He only looked at his hands and saw that the burns were gone. Days later, Ethan was discharged. He seemed calm. He no longer talked to himself. He slept without interruption. But something in him had changed. He was quieter. He looked at people with a different gaze, one that seemed to see past what they showed. That night, as he got ready for bed, he glanced at the bathroom mirror. And for a moment, he swore he saw the boy in the old shirt smiling back at him. It was then that he understood. The evil had been contained, but not destroyed. And somewhere out there, it still breathed, waiting. Life resumed, at least on the surface. Ethan returned home a week later, thinner, with deep circles under his eyes, but with a peace no one had seen in him before. He no longer screamed at night. He no longer spoke in strange tongues. He no longer saw figures in the corners of his room. Susan and Mark tried to rebuild their routine. They bought new furniture, painted the walls, and placed crucifixes in every room. It seemed the worst had passed, but deep inside, something stayed on guard, like they were waiting for the darkness to return at any moment. Pope Francis was transferred back to Rome, not by choice, but by orders from higher authorities. The church wanted to study him, examine his dreams, his behavior. Since his return, he'd begun writing compulsively in dead languages. He drew symbols with chalk across the floor of his room. He spoke in his sleep, sometimes in Nahuatl, sometimes in an unidentifiable mix of tongues. He was isolated. No one was allowed near without clearance. His face looked aged, his eyes hollow. One of the monks assigned to watch him swore he saw the priest speaking to someone invisible at dawn. Another found a carved obsidian figure under his bed, the very same one used in the ritual. The church remained silent. The official report claimed the Ethan case had been resolved successfully with no lasting spiritual effects. But those who were present knew that wasn't true. A month later, Ethan's parents' home caught fire. There was no known cause, no short circuit, no lit candles. The flames started in Ethan's old bedroom, even though he no longer slept there. Fortunately, the family had left minutes earlier to attend Sunday Mass, but neighbors reported something chilling. The night before the fire, they saw a white figure walking across the roof. It wasn't a man. It wasn't an animal. It was something else. Tall, thin. It vanished as it leapt into the backyard. Police found nothing. Shaken, Susan moved her family to another state. They wanted a fresh start, far from everything they'd endured. But deep down, Ethan knew that no matter how far they went, that night, while unpacking in their new home in Arizona, he found a drawing taped inside one of the boxes. It was a scribble he'd made as a child, a tailless jaguar. In the bottom corner was something he didn't remember writing. He hasn't left. Since then, every time he walks past a mirror, he avoids looking too long because he can feel it, that someone or something is watching him back.